This is the lecture on language acquisition, Chapter 9, for Linguistics 1. So language is extremely complex. But as we've talked about before, children already know most of the grammar of their native language, or native languages if there's more than one, before they're even 5 years old. Children acquire this language without being taught the rules of grammar by their parents, in part because parents don't consciously know the many rules of grammar. And we say acquire as opposed to learn when we're talking about child language acquisition, because that's really what they're doing. They're just observing and sort of absorbing the language that's being spoken around them. So remember that the innateness hypothesis asserts that children do not need to learn universal principles like structure dependency, remember from our syntax unit, because all of that is part of universal grammar, or UG. Children only have to learn the language-specific aspects of grammar, so the specific parameters that are inherent to the language that they're learning from their parents or from their communities. This innateness hypothesis provides an answer to the question posed by linguist Noam Chomsky, which was, what accounts for the ease, rapidity, and uniformity of language acquisition in the face of impoverished data? And by impoverished data, we mean really just data that is poor or data that is insufficient to be able to learn as much as children actually learn. An argument for the innateness hypothesis is the observation that we end up knowing more about language than what we hear around us. This argument is also known as the poverty of the stimulus, again related to this idea that the stimulus, or sort of the data that children are relying on in order to acquire their native language is, again, it's impoverished. It's not very good. Children are exposed to imperfect language. They hear slips of the tongue, they hear false starts, they hear ungrammatical and incomplete sentences. We talk in this way all the time. Children also learn aspects of language about which they receive no information. So things like structure dependency rules, nobody tells kids about that. In fact, nobody really tells adults about that unless they take a linguistics class. So again, we say the data that children are exposed to is impoverished. So just to demonstrate some examples of what we mean by this impoverished data, children somehow know how to invert the auxiliary of a main clause when they form a question. So, for example, we have the question, is the boy who is sleeping dreaming of a new car? And children will figure out how to do this, even though when you think about it, that's actually a pretty complicated construction, because you're taking the original declarative sentence, the boy who is sleeping is dreaming of a new car. So you see where that underscore, the blank is, that's where the verb is used to be. And children know to take that is verb and move it all the way to the front to form a question. They don't say, is the boy sleeping is dreaming of a new car, even though that's also a way to move the verb around. They don't do it that way. They understand structure dependency, even though that's something that's not taught to them. So kids will definitely get some instruction, usually from parents or other people, correcting their pronunciation or sometimes even correcting their grammar. But people don't have to correct things like this because children learn how to do this kind of thing. In order to do this, you have to understand structure dependency and constituent structure. So remember from our syntax unit again, which sorts of words go together, which things can be moved together, which things cannot be broken apart. These are things that, as adults, we don't consciously know this either, again, unless we take a syntax class. So we can't possibly be teaching children. So what are the stages of language acquisition in children? Interestingly, we can observe that children acquire language in similar stages no matter what language they're learning or no matter where in the world they live. And also important to keep in mind, when children are acquiring language, they do not speak a degenerate form of adult language. Rather, they speak a version of the language that conforms to the set of grammatical rules that they have developed at that stage of acquisition. One pretty interesting thing about infants, who obviously don't speak yet, but they are already building this capacity to understand the language that's spoken around them. Or, if it's a sign language, the language that's being signed around them. So, in terms of perception and production of speech sounds, infants display a pretty remarkable ability to discriminate and recognize speech sounds. They'll even respond to linguistic contrasts when those contrasts are not present in the languages spoken around them. They can perceive differences in voicing, in place of articulation, in manner of articulation, but they do not react to non-linguistic aspects of speech. So things like loudness, if there's gender-based pitch differences, non-linguistic speech sounds like coughing or laughing, things like that. They seem to understand that those are not language. So infants do appear to be born with the ability to perceive and focus on the sounds that are important for language, so they can learn any human language. You could see why this would be important, right? You could take an infant from anywhere in the world and put it in some other completely linguistically different part of the world, and that infant would grow up learning the language of wherever he or she now is. So humans have to be able to do this when they're born. But by 6 months, babies begin to lose the ability to discriminate between sounds that are not phonemic in the language that they're acquiring. So essentially, babies are born with this massive ability to perceive and to distinguish and focus on any sound in any human language, which is pretty incredible. But then already by 6 months, they're starting to focus on the particular language that's around them. So the first stage of child language acquisition that's observed, where babies are actually sort of producing something approaching language, is called babbling. This stage begins at about 6 months and considered the earliest stage of language acquisition. Now, babies may babble phonemes that do not occur in the language that they're acquiring, because remember, they're still at this stage sort of honing in on the language that they're supposed to be acquiring. 95% of babble is composed of the 12 most common consonants around the world. Early babbles mostly consist of consonant-vowel sequences, like ba, ba, that sort of thing. They do become more varied a little bit later. By 1 year, though, babbles are composed only of the phonemes used in the languages that they hear. And deaf babies, interestingly, they babble with their hands, just like hearing babies babble using sounds. So they're already starting to use that modality as a form of language production. So on to the next stage. After the age of about 1, children figure out that sounds are related to meanings, and they start to produce their first words. So usually children go through what is termed a holophrastic stage, where their one-word utterances may convey more meaning. So for example, a child at this stage might say up, used to indicate either something in the sky or to mean pick me up. So they're using a single word or maybe a single phrase, potentially, to mean a variety of different things, and the adults around them kind of have to figure out what they're talking about. But this suggests that children really know more language than they can express. And in this way, this stage sort of mirrors a little bit what you may have experienced in trying to learn a foreign language or some other language later in life, where you maybe don't have quite so many words to really express what you're trying to say, but you can understand a lot. So at this stage, we can kind of presume that children are really taking in a lot, they're understanding a whole lot, they're just finally starting to produce. One major obstacle that babies have to overcome is to be able to identify where word boundaries are. So we talked about this a bit in the unit, that people don't actually speak with each word totally separate. We often speak in a continuous stream, or at least we have like phrases that are in a continuous stream, and then we stop for a breath, and then we continue on. So for babies, that's kind of difficult. In order, they have to try to figure out where those word boundaries are. So English-speaking children, to use one example, they may use stress as a cue for word boundaries, and this strategy is called prosodic bootstrapping. We learned a little earlier in this semester that every content word in English has stress. So if a word has 2 syllables, the stress either falls on the first syllable, and this is known as trochaic stress, or the second syllable, which is known as iambic stress. But the vast majority of English words have trochaic stress. Now, experiments have shown that children do use stress as a cue for word boundaries, since most English words have stress on the first syllable. But how do children know the stress pattern of the language they're acquiring? So it's been suggested through experimental work that babies may use statistical frequency of syllable sequences to determine word boundaries. In one experiment, for example, babies were able to recognize the nonsense words pabiku, tutibu, golabu, and babupu out of strings of nonsense syllables, because those strings of syllables in the words occurred more frequently than the random string of syllables. So essentially they're identifying which strings occur more frequently, and they're picking those out of the speech stream. Children may use statistical strategies to determine a few words, so this strategy that I just talked about, and then from there they may be able to determine the rhythmic, allophonic, and phonotactic properties of the language. And then from there, now that they know those properties, they can determine even more words. So children tend to acquire the sounds common to all languages first, followed by the less common sounds of their own language. Vowels do tend to be acquired first, and consonants are ordered. They're ordered by manner of articulation, So first we have nasals, then glides, then stops, then liquids, then fricatives, and then affricates. And by place of articulation, first we have labials, velars, alveolars, and palatals. And going through this list, you can probably tell the first manners of articulation and the first places of articulation are generally just the easiest ones to produce. And then getting to the end of the list, like affricates, those are a little harder to produce. They involve more friction and more precise articulation. Same thing with palatals. Those are a little bit harder to say. And then uncommon but high frequency sounds, they may be earlier than expected, potentially. Again, talking about how children can perceive or understand more than they can produce. This is true of sounds, so children can perceive more sound contrasts than they can make in early stages. So they know more about phonology than we can tell just by listening to them speak. They have a sense of those phonological rules. When they cannot yet produce a sound, they may substitute an easier sound that's somewhat similar. And these substitutions are rule-governed. So children might reduce consonant clusters, reduplicate syllables, as in saying wah-wah for water, that's sort of a famous one, and they might drop final consonants as well. So consonants do tend to be a bit more difficult. Now on to words. So when children learn the meanings of words, they must learn the relevant features of the class of things that are referred to by that word. So, for example, they have to learn that the word dog refers to both pugs and Great Danes and everything in between, but not to cats. And this is actually a pretty sophisticated thing. When learning words, children often overextend a word's meaning. So, for example, they may use the word dog to refer to any furry, four-legged animal. We know also that overextensions do tend to be based on shape, size, or texture, but never color. So, if the child's family has a black dog, let's say, the child is not going to call any animal that's black dog, but they may do this thing where they call any pet a dog, even if it's a cat. There are also instances, though, of underextending a word's meaning. So, for example, a child might use the word dog to refer only to the family pet, as if the dog were a proper noun, as if dog were the name of the dog. So they kind of have to disambiguate all of the different ways of calling things, so that they have to learn that dog is the word for a class of type of animal, but they also have to learn the name of their own family pet. So it is a bit complicated. So psychologists and linguists who study this sort of this stage of child language acquisition have come up with the whole object principle. And this is when a child learns a new word, he or she is likely to interpret the word to refer to a whole object rather than to one of its parts. So, for example, if the child learns the new word dog, to use that example again, they're going to understand that that word refers to the entire animal and not just to the dog's tail or to the dog's paw, for example. This principle and some others may help the child learn around 5,000 words per year, which is quite a lot. It has also been put forth that children can learn the meaning of verbs based on the syntactic environment of the verbs. And this is known as syntactic bootstrapping. So that term bootstrapping, again, really just referring to when a child is relying on sort of contextual clues or knowledge that they have already to deduce the meaning of some new word. The acquisition of morphology in children clearly demonstrates the rule-governed nature of language acquisition. The one thing that we observe is that children typically learn a morphological rule and then overgeneralize. And children seem to go through 3 stages in the acquisition of an irregular form. In phase 1 of this acquisition of irregular forms, they use the standard irregular past tense forms because they have learned these irregulars as separate lexical items. So, for example, the verb to break, the past tense of that is broke, which is irregular. Same thing with bring, the past tense brought, also irregular. We don't say bringed. So at this phase, children are learning all of these things as like separate, you could think of them as separate dictionary entries. Like that brought is not actually part of bring, it's just a totally separate verb. By phase 2, the child has learned the rule, though, for past tense, and therefore the child starts attaching the regular past tense morpheme, so that ed ending that we usually use to make past tense, attaching that to the irregular verb. So at this phase, the child will start saying braked or bringed instead of broke or brought, which they had been saying before. So it might seem a little bit like they're regressing, but really they're actually progressing because they're learning the rule and they're applying it everywhere they see that it should be applied. And they would be right, except that these are irregular forms. So finally, phase 3, the child realizes that there are exceptions to the morphological rule. And then the child will bring the standard irregular forms back into their vocabulary. So they'll start again saying broke and brought instead of braked and bringed. Some additional observations that we can make about how children acquire morphology is, first off, called the WUG test. This is a test where you show a child a toy and you tell the child that this toy is called a WUG. And then you bring in multiple of this same toy and you ask them what they are or how many are there, and they'll give you the plural of the WUG. So they'll tell you, oh, there are 2 WUGs, or those are WUGs. And in doing so, that child has actually applied the plural morpheme, that S ending, to a word that is, well, not a word in English, it's a made-up word. But the fact that they're able to do this demonstrates that children apply the correct plural allomorph to nouns that they have never heard before. And this in turn shows that they have an understanding of natural classes of phonemes, and they're not just imitating words that they've heard before. That would be impossible in this case, since there is no such thing as a WUG. We also see that children acquiring languages other than English learn subject-verb agreement very early. English is a little bit wonky in this regard, and in others there's a lot of irregularity in English, but for the most part, if you treat English as sort of an outlier, we do see that subject-verb agreement is something that kids grasp somewhat early on. Children also demonstrate their knowledge of derivational rules and can create new words. So, for example, a child might make up the word broomed to mean swept. So they might say, I broomed the floor, for example, which is pretty clever if you think about it. So on to the acquisition of syntax. How are these words put together in a sentence? So at about 2 years of age, children start to put words together to form two-word utterances. And this is sort of the next stage in language acquisition. So we talked about the one-word stage, now we're on to two words. What's interesting to note is that the intonation contour of these utterances extends over the two words as a unit, and that the two-word utterances can convey a range of meanings. So you might hear a two-word utterance such as "mommy sock," and this could mean a few things. It could mean that the child is talking about a sock that belongs to mommy. It could mean the child is asking mommy to help the child put her socks on, something like that. But there's starting to be a bit more meaning involved in the child's utterances. All of this comes with an important caveat that chronological age is really not a good measure of linguistic development because there are pretty big individual differences between children. So instead, linguists use the child's mean length of utterance, the acronym MLU, to measure development. Another stage of development in child language acquisition is the telegraphic stage. Now this describes a phase when children tend to omit function morphemes, and you'll recall these are morphemes such as articles, subject pronouns, auxiliary verbs, inflection. So in a couple of real examples of child speech, a child might say, "He play little tune," or "Andrew want that." So you'll notice you can grasp pretty well what the child is trying to say with these utterances, even if they are missing some components that an adult speaker wouldn't leave out. So in the first example, "He play little tune," the child has left out the article, and also the subject and verb don't agree. If it's past tense, the child may be trying to convey that it's past tense, but it doesn't have the past tense marker on the verb. So little function morphemes like that are missing. However, these sentences do still have hierarchical constituent structure like adult sentences. So these telegraphic utterances, we can say, they're not just words strung together. But they have some structure already built in. They reveal the child's knowledge of syntactic rules. And we can see here a couple of tree diagrams for those two example utterances from the previous slide, showing that very constituent structure that we know that children are aware of. So that first example on the left, "He play little tune," and on the right, "Andrew want that." So we know that a child has to know the syntactic categories of words in order to apply syntactic rules. And how do they figure this out? Well, one strategy that they can use is semantic bootstrapping. This is when children first use the meaning of a word to figure out its syntactic category. So if a child learns the meaning of the word dog, for example, then they'll start to realize, oh, that must be a noun. In the same way that adults might do the same thing with a new word. Word frames may also help children determine the syntactic categories for words. This is another way of saying just the sort of context that a word will appear in, or what are the words that surround it frequently. So for example, some frames such as "you blank it" and "the blank one," these occur frequently enough that kids may be able to identify which words are likely to occur in each frame. So in the first example there, "you blank it," it's pretty likely there's going to be a verb of some sort in between those two words. You ate it, you caught it, etc., etc. And the blank one, that's got to be an adjective in that slot, right? The yellow one, the big one. So if a child hears those frames, then whatever word comes in the middle, even if they don't know it yet, they may be able to apply this pattern that they've observed. Between about 2 years, 6 months, and 3 years, 6 months, a language explosion occurs in a child's development. And by the age of 3, most children consistently use function morphemes. So remember those articles and inflections, things like that. And they can produce complex syntactic structures. So these are a couple of examples from a 3-year-old. He was stuck and I got him out, and it's too early for us to eat. If you look at all of what's going on in those sentences, those are actually somewhat complicated. The first example has a couple of different verbs, different actions on, one event sort of following another. And the second example has this dummy subject, the it's, and for us to eat, that's sort of a strange construction there as well. So it's interesting to observe a child at the age of 3 already grasping really well some of these more intricate constructions. After about 3 years, 6 months, children can produce WH questions and relative pronouns. So pronouns like that, who, whom. And then sometime after about 4 years, children have acquired most of the adult syntactic competence. So they're basically like adult speakers at that point. Now, of course, there's still a lot of vocabulary that they will learn over their lifetime before they sound really like an adult. But in terms of syntactic competence, so being able to grammatically string a sentence together, they are basically fluent at this point. So we've seen how children acquire the sounds and sound system of their language, how they acquire morphology, the words, how words are put together, and then finally the syntax of their language. But as we've seen before in this class, there are additional levels of linguistic competence. One of those is pragmatics, so being able to use language in context. So one thing that we can observe in child language acquisition is that children often have problems with deictic terms. These are terms where the referent shifts depending on who's saying the thing or when it's being said. Pronouns are an example of this. So I am referring to myself as I right now, but you would refer to me as, the word you if you're talking to me. So these are deictic terms where depending on who's speaking, they'll change. So because of this, sometimes children refer to themselves as you, because when people talk to them, when adults talk to them, they use that word you. So they may think that that's their name. They also tend to have problems with the context-dependent nature of these terms. Children will sometimes assume that the hearer knows who she's talking about when really only the child knows, or the hearer wasn't in the room at the time, something like that. So we can look a little bit more closely at the development of auxiliary verbs. So in the telegraphic stage, children often omit auxiliaries from their speech, as was mentioned previously, but they can form questions. They will often do this by using rising intonation, And also they can form negative sentences. So for example, they might say something like, I ride train, instead of the fully formed question with the auxiliary, do I ride the train? Or will I ride the train? And in terms of negative sentences, a child might say something like, I not like this book. So that also is omitting an auxiliary, the do auxiliary, I do not like this book. So these are some examples that show us that kids do have a bit of a harder time getting to that level where they have a grasp of auxiliaries, because it is more difficult. However, as children acquire auxiliaries in questions and negative sentences, we see that they generally use them correctly. So they're going along not using auxiliaries, just sort of getting by, but observing older speakers using them correctly, and then eventually they start to incorporate them into their speech, and then from then on they use them correctly. So they don't start off using them incorrectly and then have to correct themselves. So we've talked before about universal grammar and the principles and parameters theory of universal grammar. So just to refresh, parameters are aspects of language that you would sort of turn on or off as in a light switch. You can think about it that way, depending on what the language is that you are acquiring, so the language that's around you. For example, one of these parameters is the word order of a language. So we're all born into this world with the ability to learn a language with any possible word order, but we end up settling on the word order of our native language, and that is an example of parameter setting. So we can see that children acquire these parameters very early. They learn that their language has a particular word order, for example, pretty early. They'll also observe whether the language has the head or the complement first. They'll observe whether the language allows movement. And this theory is said to account for some of the mystery behind how it's possible that children learn language, or acquire language, I should say, so rapidly and with such ease relative to adults. Now we've really been focusing on spoken languages, but sign languages are acquired by children in much the same way. Deaf babies acquire sign language in the same stages that hearing babies do. So the babbling stage, that holophrastic stage, the telegraphic stage that was talked about earlier. When deaf babies are not exposed to sign language, and this does happen unfortunately sometimes, they will create their own signs, complete with systematic rules. As we saw in the example of the children in Nicaragua. This fact that children will sort of spontaneously just start to create their own language in a way, it demonstrates that humans have this drive to communicate and to use language. Since these children do appear to be creating some sort of rudimentary language without any input at all. So sometimes people wonder, well, are children maybe just imitating what they hear? And there is a role of imitation to some extent, but language acquisition goes far beyond mere imitation. And we know this because children will produce utterances that they could not have possibly heard from adults around them. And some of the errors that they make, that I talked about earlier, are evidence of this. So they might say something like holded or tooths, which are actually correct applications of the rule, the past tense rule and the pluralization rule, but it just so happens that those words are irregular in English, so adults don't use them. Children cannot imitate adults fully while acquiring grammar because they also make some mistakes in syntax that we can see. So an adult would say, "Where can I put them?" for example. A child might say, though, "Where I can put them." And children who develop the ability to speak later in their childhood, they can understand the language spoken around them even if they cannot imitate it. There's another theory as well that says that children learn through positive and negative reinforcement. But we know that parents don't really correct their children's speech very much. If they do, it's based more on pronunciation and factual accuracy rather than grammatical accuracy. So it's unusual for parents to, for example, tell them that they need to use the auxiliary verb when they didn't use the auxiliary verb. That's an example of a grammatical error. Parents do sometimes recast children's utterances. That's where you sort of say what the child said again with a slight change to it to sort of make it correct. They don't really do this consistently, and they also tend to recast grammatical sentences to reinforce correct content. So a child might say something that's already grammatically correct, but they use the wrong word for something, for example, and a parent might come in and say the same thing but change the word so that it's correct. But that's not really teaching them language. It's more just teaching them the word for something, so teaching vocabulary. Another theory asserts that children hear a sentence and then use it as a model to form other sentences by analogy. So this may work in some situations, but certainly not in all situations. So we can see some examples below of how this doesn't really work all the time. So a child might hear the sentence, "I painted a red barn," and they might also hear the sentence, "I painted a barn red." Both of those are okay. A child might also hear, "I saw a red barn." But then we can't say, "I saw a barn red," even though that did work with the verb painted. So that's a situation in which the child can't simply rely on analogy to know that that last example is not okay. And they don't make these kinds of mistakes. And this shows that they do understand structure dependency at a very young age. It's also been suggested that children are able to learn language because adults speak to them in a simplified form of language. This is sometimes referred to as motherese. Child-directed speech is the sort of more technical term. You may hear baby talk as well. And this certainly is something that adults do in some places. But motherese is not syntactically simple. It doesn't drop verb inflections or omit function words. It may be a little bit more simple than standard adult speech, but it doesn't really explain a lot of child acquisition. And we also have seen that in many cultures, adults don't even do this at all. And yet, children in those cultures acquire language in the same exact way as children who are exposed to motherese or child-directed speech. So we know that it can't really be that that's helping children all over the world learn language. So a little bit about childhood bilingualism. We've been talking mostly about how a child will acquire their native language or the language of their parents, but oftentimes there are multiple languages going on that a child is acquiring. Um, Bilingual language acquisition, or sometimes called simultaneous bilingualism, this refers to the acquisition of two languages simultaneously from infancy. And actually, about half the people in the world are bilingual or multilingual. And in many parts of the world, bilingualism or multilingualism even is actually the norm. This may occur if members of the child's family speak different languages. Say the grandparents speak something other than what the parents speak, or maybe there are cousins or siblings who speak something else, and the child has about, it's close to the same amount of exposure to both of those languages and therefore is able to acquire both of them. There are a couple of theories of how this works. So the unitary system hypothesis is the idea that the child initially constructs only one lexicon and grammar. Some evidence for this hypothesis is that there is language mixing similar to code switching while the child is developing. This might suggest that there are lexical items or vocabulary words that exist only in one language. Some evidence against this is that there is a lot of overlap in the lexicon for each language, and children may have gaps because each language is used in different contexts, and they can only learn so many words each day. The separate systems hypothesis is the idea that the child builds a distinct lexicon and grammar for each language. Some evidence for this is where the two languages diverge grammatically, the child will acquire two different sets of rules. We also see that bilingual children select which language to use based on the context. So if the child learns how to cook from their grandmother, let's say, in language A, but then learns about other things, say books from a parent who speaks language B, then the child will use those two languages in those respective domains. Also, children bilingual in sign language and a spoken language may say a word in one language and sign it in the other simultaneously. Now, we don't know exactly how much input in each language a child needs to become fully bilingual. One strategy that parents sometimes employ is the one person, one language strategy, where one parent speaks only language A to the child and the other speaks only language B while the child is developing their linguistic capacity. This is difficult, potentially, for parents to kind of adhere to this strategy, but it can have pretty great results. We do know that bilingual children tend to have better metalinguistic awareness than monolingual speakers. This means they have more conscious knowledge about language. They can talk about language. And this knowledge, this metalinguistic awareness, really helps them later in life. It helps them to be able to understand more about how they're thinking and how their thought process works, and it's also helpful later on if they decide to learn an additional language. Now, just a few words about second language acquisition. This refers to the process by which older adults learn a language later in life, so after childhood. Most adult language learners never become fully proficient in their second language, even if they live in a different country for a very long time, and they are, very good at speaking, they feel comfortable, they're still likely to make errors. And these errors tend to be unlike children's errors. And then unfortunately, a lot of times these errors become fossilized, and this actually means that through habit of doing the same error over and over, the speaker will just be so used to saying something a certain way that it'll just become entrenched. There is this fundamental difference hypothesis, which states that learning a second language is a different process than learning a first language. That different principles are drawn upon in L2 learning than in L1 acquisition. The L2 learners do demonstrate rule-governed interlanguage grammars. So they do still rely on those rules, those patterns that we observe depending on whichever language they're using. One obvious difference between first language acquisition and second language acquisition is that in L2 acquisition, a speaker already knows a language, their own native language. So oftentimes you'll get this process of transfer. Learners often transfer phonological, syntactic, and morphological rules from that first language to their second language. And this is what results in what we hear as an accent. So that generally is phonological properties from a person's native language kind of spilling over into their second language. Not everything, though, transfers from the L1 to the L2, and sometimes second language learners will make errors that can't really be explained by their native language. So we see this as well. With different native languages, L1s, go through similar stages when learning their L2s. So in other words, a speaker whose native language is Chinese and a speaker whose native language is Spanish, let's say they're both learning English, those two will go through similar stages, even though Spanish and Chinese are very different from each other. So this suggests that there might be some universal developmental principles like those in first language acquisition. Heritage language learners are a unique type of adult language learner. They're not exactly an L2 learner. This is someone who was raised with a strong cultural connection to a language, usually through family members, and who then chooses to study that language more formally. Sometimes this person has no prior linguistic knowledge of the language, or on the other hand, they may be fully bilingual, fully fluent, but they want to learn, say, a more academic version of that language or something. Oftentimes they're in between there, though. Heritage language learners usually have some experience with the language. They've maybe heard quite a bit of it from their family. Maybe they can say a few words. Maybe they can talk about some things or have a simple conversation, but they're not terribly comfortable. So increasingly there are language courses that are geared towards these heritage language learners. You may have seen these popping up. So a question that has been really debated about language acquisition generally is whether there is a critical period. It's somewhat accepted that there is a critical period, or at least a sensitive period, for child language acquisition, that children have to be exposed to language by a certain age in order to be able to really be able to become fluent in language. And usually that's believed to be around age 12, 13, something like that. It's harder to say whether that's true for second language acquisition. Most researchers would not claim that it's impossible to acquire a new language after a certain age, but it does appear to get harder as one gets older. So there may be sensitive periods for acquiring certain aspects of L2. It does seem to be that the sensitive period for phonology is the smallest. It seems that it's very difficult to acquire a second language, or third, fourth, whatever it is, without an accent after the childhood years. Other aspects of language seem to have a larger window, so adults seem to be able to learn things like morphological rules or syntax, perhaps with a bit more time, a bit more study, a bit more exposure, but that person will, in almost all cases, still retain some sort of an accent, because it really is difficult to retrain your articulators in a way that allows you to sound fully native. And we will end this lecture here, and I'll see you next time we meet.